We're going to get going. We're running a few minutes behind, and for that I apologize, but because of the length of lunch, these panels have been running a little bit over. But this is the panel that Ben is going to moderate, and I want to remind people that there are QR codes on either side of you that you can ask questions. They will be fed into a tablet that Ben has up with him. And this panel is, I think, extremely important. Being a veteran, it's just great that we're dealing with these issues. And I want to thank everybody here for attending, and I want to thank the panel. And with that, Ben, you're on.
Great. Thank you so much. And thank you, everyone. And for the folks who are watching on live stream, welcome as well. My name is Joe Plunzler. I'll be your host today for this afternoon session. If you're here for the learning from veteran service organizations, you're in the right place. If you're not, I promise you this will be better and more fun than anything you had planned earlier today. So as for me, I'm a 20-year combat veteran of the U.S. Marine Corps, held leadership positions in 3 different veteran service organizations over the last 6 years. And my path to military service actually came about because I attended a protest, a Klan and a neo-Nazi counter-protest in my college town in 1990. And it was at that point where that experience was really formative for me, and I realized that when it comes down to absolute matters of value, sometimes you need to put your body where your values are, which is one of the reasons I joined the Marine Corps. So that was more than 30 years ago. We know hate-fueled violence continues to be a threat to our communities. As my We the Veterans colleague Bill Braniff testified in 2019, over the last decade, perpetrators of domestic violence and terrorism and hate crimes were more numerous, more lethal, engaged in more plots and financial crimes, and had a higher success rate in their violent plots than foreign terrorist groups like Al-Qaeda and ISIS, and the homegrown violent extremists inspired them despite their continued threat to America. Since then, the number of lethal attacks has generally continued on an upward trend, resulting in several years where 70 or more attacks occurred, the higher numbers than we've seen since the 1980s. Domestic violent extremist groups have been and are today working to infiltrate our military and spread their views and recruit in the veteran community. While the majority of our nation's 17 million veterans are respectable, law-abiding citizens, the number of veterans involved in DVE crimes has risen sharply from fewer than 20 in 2016 to 120 in 2021. And approximately 17% of those facing January 6th related charges have military-related backgrounds, which is a good segue to our topic, how extremism impacts the military and veteran community and what we can learn from America's leading veteran service organizations on what to do to combat it. And our panelists today are all military veterans. They're all leaders of veteran service organizations. So joining us today is Susan Thaxton, a former U.S. Navy officer and now Chief Strategy Officer at The Mission Continues, and Jeremy Butler, also a former U.S. Navy officer and now CEO of Iraq and Afghanistan Veterans of America. So welcome all. Thanks for making the drive up to Pittsburgh. And could you just introduce yourselves and just tell us a little bit about what your organizations do?
Yes, well, thank you. So like Joe said, my name is Susan Thaxton. I'm the Chief Strategy Officer at The Mission Continues. So we're a national veteran service organization that gets veterans to continue their service by volunteering in under-resourced communities across the country. And hearing what Joe just talked about there, it's like the furthest thing from what we see with our veterans, that it's upsetting to hear because it's just not at all the experience that we have. We know that there are so many veterans who are out there, they take off the uniform and their service is not done. And they're ready to find a new purpose. And we give them that opportunity by going out and volunteering together with veterans and with non-veterans in under-resourced communities. So we have what we call service platoons in 40 cities across the country. And they work with local nonprofit organizations to get veterans leading by planning and executing on community service. And this is great for our veterans. It gives, like I said, connection and purpose that they desperately need. They may not know it right when they leave the military, but they figure it out eventually. And it's great for our communities. They get to see what veterans are all about, and they also really benefit from it. I talked with a community partner last week, and he said, never underestimate the value of manpower to really help us move our mission. And that's what our veterans are really great at. Give them a task, have them work together, and just get some stuff done. And it's great for our veterans, and it's great for the communities in which they serve.
Excellent. And I'm Jeremy Butler. I'm the Chief Executive Officer of Iraq and Afghanistan Veterans of America. Our focus primarily is on advocacy and policy changes. We work in Washington, D.C. with Congress, with the VA, with the Department of Defense, with the administration to pass legislation, to change policy, to better support the broader veteran community and most often the post-9/11 veteran community. In addition to that, we have a direct support program called the Quick Reaction Force that works with veterans and their families to get them connected to resources that they need. And then we focus on national communication because anything that we want to bring about, we can't do alone. And so we try to raise awareness amongst the nation, both veterans, non-veterans, veteran supporters, people that just kind of are interested in hearing about what's going on, about the issues that our veterans are facing, try and give them the truth, and also try and give them pathways to help. And we love partnering with the Mission Continues and with other organizations because that is the way we not only get our mission done, but support these other missions because there is so much overlap. And as Susan was saying, the veterans that you guys see are the ones that are out there continuing the mission, not to just co-opt your name right there as you do, but continuing the mission because so much of the post-9/11 generation wants to continue to serve. They hang up the uniform, but they join because they want to serve and they want to continue to do that. So as a counter, we also see a lot of that, but we also see the veterans that are not having that success. Through our Quick Reaction Force, a lot of the reason veterans reach out to us for support is because they're not finding that community or they're not getting the support from the VA that they need or they're just struggling in general, and we want to help them make that connection. And the fact is that there's a lot of veterans that need that help, and I think it ties straight into this conversation because what we see there and the ways you help that are going to directly support what we're trying to do here, eradicate hate, change the way so many people, not just veterans, but so many in this country end up down this pathway towards extremism and hatred.
Thank you. My first question is pretty broad. I want to ask kind of a global question first, and the question is, can we eradicate hate? And if not, what's the real mission here?
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in on that one. And I think, and I hate to start off on a negative, but I think the answer is no, but I think that I say that not because I don't like the idea and embrace the idea, but I think in order to figure out what you're going to do, you need to be aware of the limitations. And it's not different, I don't think, than something like the global war on terror or the war on drugs. Like, you can have an end state that you want to get to, but if you're not aware of the reality, you may very well have a strategy or devise a strategy that is not going to get you there. And so the reason why I say all that is because the way we are going to fix this problem is by continuing to work on this forever. There's no end state. There's no 20-year plan that gets us to the end of our goals here. This is something that has to continue day in, day out, oftentimes in ways that don't necessarily seem on their face to overlap with the mission. And I think that's how you get it. And we've been talking about this. It's been great conversation among so many of us throughout this forum so far this week about how far to the left of this we need to get in order to solve this problem. And I would love to, we can go on more on that, but I think that's the key. And that's why I say you're not going to eradicate any of these things, but you are going to need to continue to focus on them, and you can definitely have success.
Yeah, absolutely, Susan.
And I would agree. I think it would be naive in some ways to say we're going to eradicate it, but I think also, building on what you said before, that we all have our own lanes. And maybe getting out of our lane sometimes or finding where the overlap is, and none of us are going to really even make huge changes on our own. Jeremy and I represent 2 veteran service organizations of many, and the importance of the community itself getting behind this and really giving lots of options for where veterans can tap in, where they feel it's best for them, and being able to play our part in it.
Awesome. Thank you. I want to ask you a question that I've heard last night from some folks attending the conference, and the discussion came around January 6th, right? We know that 17% of the veterans arrested so far, and I just checked with Bill today, that's the accurate percentage, had military backgrounds. So the question is, if 17% of the arrestees had military backgrounds, but we only represent less than 5% of the population, is the military radicalizing these young men and women?
Do you want me to start?
Go ahead.
Okay. It's a great question, and I think, and it's been very interesting. You mentioned how Bill testified before the House. It was the House Veterans Affairs Committee. Yeah. That was the second, or there was 2 of those hearings. I testified in one of them. Definitely a very contentious day, that's for sure. Both of them were, and I think what you're asking kind of gets it to the root of why there was contention, and I think it's a very important question to discuss. And the reason it was contentious is because people felt that we were attacking veterans, or we were attacking the military by saying there is a problem. And that was the counter to it, is this is a handful of people, this does not represent our military or our veteran community. And I think we all completely agree. But I think the disagreement comes from, does that or does that not mean it's an issue that needs to be faced? And those of us that were testifying were saying it is something that needs to be faced, absolutely. My general view is that it is not that the Department of Defense is creating extremists. There might be some issues in there that we need to tackle, certainly, but that's not, I think, where the cause or the solution lies. It's not that veterans are somehow preternaturally disposed towards extremism. That's not the issue either. I think there's two primary pathways to fixing this, and they overlap with what we are all doing, and that is improving the way the DoD transitions service members to veterans, and then the way we support as a country and handle veterans and veterans' needs as they progress through their life as a veteran. And if we tackle those two things, that's where we're really going to have success. And that's why we were there testifying that day. Not to say DoD's broken, things like that, but we need to address this because they do, when it manifests itself within the Department of Defense or within the veteran community, it has an outside influence, negative outside influence on all of us that continue to serve.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks.
And I think in one of the panels yesterday, they also talked about that veterans who are involved in criminal activity in this way, it's 10 years on average that actually happens. And so that's really significant, right? So if it was if it was the problem was solely or only happening and radicalizing active duty, then you would see it much sooner. I'm not educating this, I'm making an assumption on this. But the fact that it's 10 years out, there's something happening in those 10 years, right? That loss of connection, that loss of purpose, feeling like they've lost their way, and somebody else is filling a void that they didn't have before. And whether that started before or during or after, but there's something happening in there. And so, like Jeremy was saying, it's so what are we doing to prevent that happening over those 10 years, for people hitting that point, and where are all the places that things are falling? And it's a wide span, and we know that veterans, there are mental health issues that a lot of people in the veteran community are facing. Veterans have a higher suicide rate than the average person too. These are all tied together. So again, going back to what Jeremy was saying, it's what are we doing with veterans, not about it just being for the veteran, but also with the veteran, and how are we seeing veterans in a way that they have a lot to bring as well, and that we're tapping into that to give them that feeling of like they haven't lost it all, like there's still opportunity, hope, connection, all of that, so they don't get to that place.
Yeah, and that 10-year number really spoke to me, because when I was at Wounded Warrior Project, in our annual survey, we realized that the average length of time for a veteran to approach the organization for help for mental or physical health care or economic health care was 10 years. And so, the going in thought was like, I've tried every other option, life's not working out for me, now I'm at the point where I'm actually going to reach out. And so, I know it's correlation, not causation, but it's just kind of an interesting time period, and I'm just curious how that fits. And I think that's one of the things that requires further study, right? Like, how do you feel? There's been a lot of talk and increased emphasis within the Department of Defense on addressing extremism. And, we've seen the recent approach from Secretary Austin. There was that 24-star letter after January 6th, which kind of unprecedented, where the chairman and the service chiefs put out a letter to remind everyone what our military's values are. And Jeremy, you brought it to my attention the War on the Rocks letter. Was it the former Secretaries of Defense and Chairman of Joint Chiefs of Staff recently put out a missive, really kind of cautioning America. Do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, and I thought it was, I think I initially characterized it as like an op-ed or something like that, but it wasn't even really that. They kind of wrote a paragraph intro, and then it was just summarizing bullets of, this is what is the mandates, this is what is expected of you, this is how you're supposed to operate in the military and things like that. And I think it spoke to several things. For me, January 6th was certainly a turning point. IAVA as an organization was almost, and me personally, was kind of made aware that this was a bigger problem with that happened. And that has continued. And I think you see it in that letter, which again is addressing a very small problem within our community, but one that has to be addressed. And so it speaks to, I think, how important that it is. But it also speaks to, in my view, the challenges and the issues that we face within the political arena. And,
Right.
I think we're going to talk about the Vet the Vote push on poll workers and stuff like that, but we were then talking a little bit more. It goes deeper and beyond that. And I think it has to do with a lot of how we fix the way we as Americans, not just veterans, not just military, but as Americans that are eligible to vote, how we approach our democracy. And I think there's changes that we need to make, that we can make, that will have a profound impact on improving the way we all feel about whether or not we are in a democracy that represents us. Because I think that's kind of getting at the root. We often, when you talk about extremism, it's often that you don't feel represented.
Right.
You're disconnected, you have some grievances that you feel no one is listening to you, and that's kind of on a scale. Like, I think we all kind of feel that way sometimes. It doesn't mean we're turning to extremism, but I think we often feel the way things are going in Congress and Washington, D.C., we're like, this is not a government that is listening to me or representing me.
Right.
We can get into those details. And I know we've talked about them a little bit, so I don't want to jump ahead. But
Yeah. No, it's all good points. Susan, what do you think?
Yeah, and I think it is that idea about where did they fit in, like who's not representing. I think one of the concerns too that I have, so the veterans that were caught, right? We know it's that percentage of it, and then you wonder how many other veterans were standing outside or were there, not necessarily that they knew what they were getting into, right? They may have just been there, because they were upset, they had a grievance, whatever it was, and this was their way to express their frustration or anger. So it's not necessarily they were going there because they wanted to take over the Capitol. There may have been more there, but again, going back to this lack of feeling that they're being represented, that they're being heard, and I think one of the concerns personally that I have is to immediately shun them, right? Like, we want no part of them, because what is that going to do for us if we say that, well, if you're not on board with the way we think and the way we feel and the way we're approaching this, we don't want to hear from you at all. We need the veteran community as a whole to be engaging in this and be talking about this and to be aware of this and being sure that we're listening to, not necessarily the whole thing, but at least, making sure that we're getting a broad spectrum of ideas, of issues, of challenges that people are facing, and try to work through that rather than saying, this is the way we approach it and you need to get on board to be with us, or we're just going to put you in that category of storming the Capitol, and we don't want any part of that. I remember right after it happened, talking to one of the other veteran service organizations, and all of us biting our nails going, please don't let one of our T-shirts show up out there, right? Yeah. But it was very much a real concern that we had. But even, we were talking about how do you find, even if you find out one of your veterans was out there, what do you do at this point? Do you really want to just write them off, or do you kind of say, where do we have a place in this that we can help?
Yeah. And as that was coming, like kind of rolling out the whole J6 thing, I was getting texts from a fairly prominent reporter that you'd recognize if you saw, and she was like, you won't believe the number of veterans in this crowd. And I was like, you got to be kidding me. And she's like, no, seriously, I'm seeing flags of veteran service organizations. I'm seeing, and that, like you, was at first I felt rage, and then I felt really profound sadness around that. It's kind of like, where along the lines did we fail as an institution? Did we fail, to fully inculcate our values, right? Because like the true patriots were the ones defending the cathedral of our democracy, right? But to your point, Susan, I think it's really interesting is the part about, having a nuance where it's not like, okay, well, you showed up there, you may or may not have done things, but now there's no pathway back for you. So like you're forever shunned, which we know would just lead to more recalcitrant type behavior, right? Because if they can't come back into the fold, I think that's an interesting thing. I think, the folks that committed crimes, definitely need to be held accountable. But the ones who, there needs to be some sort of engagement from us to pull them back into the fold.
And what I would say, I would add to that is, ideally, that's what we kind of want to solve, is to engage with them before it gets to the point where, anyone feels that their only recourse is to, either storm the Capitol or be around those that are doing so.
Sure.
And that's the goal.
Would you agree, trying to find the locus of this problem, and I'm thinking through Department of Defense, 2.3 million active duty guardsmen and reservists, Uniform Code of Military Justice, tons of supervision. Is the problem there, or is it somewhere other than there, right? It's composed the veteran community, 17 million, no legal architecture around that, no supervision around that, right? It's a thornier thing, I think.
Yeah. I'm still in the reserves, and so when the DoD came out with its extremism training and stuff like that, I took it, whatever you want to call the verb or whatever for that. And my thought was, I'm glad we're doing something, but this is not where the problem is going to be fixed. It's kind of generally the feeling within the Department of Defense is that SecDef can put stuff out and service chiefs can put stuff out, but the only way you're going to have success is if it's down at the deck plate level, to use a Navy term, where it's embraced, understood, and not seen as some just one of those other GMTs, the general military trainings that you have to get through, but an understanding of that there is a problem, here's what we're doing, and here's how we can support. And so unfortunately, I would say we haven't really gotten beyond that DoD directed training, but at the same time, as we were just saying, I don't think the problem is within DoD. I think that was some quick turn action by them, which is good to see DoD at least embracing it, but the fix probably is not really there, because as we were saying, or at least in my view, that's not truly where the problem is. There's certainly issues within the military, but that's not where the big problem is and where it lies.
Yeah. So what do you think?
I would just say I agree with that, and I think that, again, it's kind of, like Jeremy said earlier, I think January 6th highlighted for our organizations and organizations like ours where we have a place in this, right? And it doesn't mean we're going to become the, anti-extremist organization, but it's more of our organizations have a part in this, and that we do engage veterans to be doing, participating in this, in the community and engaging in, creating civic health and those type of things. So, again, are we going to fix it with the 2 million, or are there things that we're doing with the far larger veteran community?
Yeah, and I think I'm hearing both of you talking about working to the left of the issue, so to speak, with that critical transition of I've been in a culture for maybe 4 years in an enlistment, or maybe I did 20 or 30 and I'm retiring. Now I'm navigating back from that very discrete culture with obvious signs of rank and position and connectivity and an intense closeness, going out into the civilian world where I've got to figure it all out all over again, right? So that middle to civ transition is a real inflection point for a lot of transitioning veterans. How does that come into play? What's the VA's responsibility in that? From the handoff from DoD to VA, so to speak.
Yeah, and I'm happy. Sorry, I'm grabbing my iPad because I wanted to bring up something. So IAVA does a annual. It's shifted between annual and biannual. Does biannual mean every 2 years, or is that every half year?
I think it can mean both. Yeah, I think it's one of those things that can mean twice a year.
Exactly. Well, then let me correct. It has been annual. It's been every 2 years recently. But point being, one of the questions that we ask on it is about transition. And let's see. How would you rate your experience in the transition assistance program, which, for those that don't know, every service kind of does their own, here's how to prepare for getting out. And the vast majority ranked it as fair. And then the next highest rankings were poor and very poor. So, and this was just completed last year, not very good. And my own personal experience certainly ties in with that, but that was many years ago when I went through TAP. But there's this constant attempt to improve it, and we still have a long way to go. And tied into that was the other questions that we asked were, do you feel like a valued member of your community? Do you feel a sense of belonging in your community? And both of those questions also correlated to the majority answers were I neither agree nor disagree with that, or I somewhat disagree or strongly disagree. Meaning, people are struggling with the transition period, and then that is carrying over to their time there. So all that is a long way to say that, in my view, the answer is one, we need to do a better job preparing veterans, or service members, I should say, for them becoming a veteran. And then we need to do a much better job very quickly embracing them as veterans. And I think that's where there's overlap. And we've talked about this, about how can we get DoD to do a better job bringing in veteran service organizations so that it's not once a service member becomes a veteran that the first time they're hearing about it. Like, and I get it. Like, a lot of service members, they don't really are thinking about becoming a veteran. They're focused on other stuff. But groups like the Mission Continues and Team Rubicon, where it's not so much about your veteran identity, it's more about like creating a purpose and having that sense of purpose. And I think that's what we hear so often amongst the post 9/11 community, especially, is, you joined the military because you wanted to serve and you wanted a purpose. Right. It's like, hey, on your way out, sign up with Mission Continues so they can tell you wherever you're going to live, there's a service platoon in your area where you can just roll on out and start volunteering, meet people, meet other veterans, whatever it is you're looking for, and be able to make that connection. And then as you're like, and now I'm struggling to find a job, or I'm still trying to figure out how to use my GI Bill, it's like, hey, we've got people here lifting a shovel right next to you that can help with that, and we can pass you on to other organizations that can directly support you.
Yeah, definitely. And Susan, could you elaborate a little bit more about what an organization like yours offers veterans? Like, the antidote to extremism is what?
So for us, it's community service in a sense, and that sounds more simple than it is. So like I said, we have service platoons in 40 cities, and so we pull, it's veteran led, so they go through a leadership development program with us if they want to lead these efforts. So there's a skill building that goes along with this. It's a way to transition their leadership skills into working in communities. A lot of their military leadership skills transfer really, really well, particularly in that area, because they've had to do community building in a very different way and during their military experience. And then having them go actually lead out in their communities. They recruit other veterans, but they recruit non-veterans as well. And they're out in communities that most of them would never go into and be a part of in any other way. And so, perfect example of kind of how it opens up the mind a little bit and where this can kind of be an antidote to this is, I was at a project on Saturday in DC, and we were working at a school, and we work with a lot of schools and community centers and community gardens, just doing, a lot of it's just manual labor, right? We just get in there and work, and the veterans love it. It's kind of, a lot of them say it's kind of brings them back to the best part of their service. But we were at a project in DC, and it was on the east side of the river, which is not where downtown DC is. And we ran out of water. And so I was like, I'll go get more water. And I asked the platoon leader, where should I go? And he said, there's a Safeway, it's about a mile away. Okay. I get in my car, because I had a car and I could drive over for a mile. It took me an hour to go get water and I had a car, and came back, and he even texted me at one point. He said, "Are you okay?" I'm like, "Yeah, this is just taking forever," right? And he and I got back, and I said, "Sorry, that just took forever." And he said, "Welcome to food desert, baby." Yeah. And having that experience of being able to see a very different experience than my own, and being able to it's not like I'm going to go out and become this major advocate to end food deserts, but maybe next time I hear about a food desert, I can place a community with that, I can place a face with it, and I can think about it a lot differently, and maybe have some empathy and see the issue just a little bit differently, or at least ask myself, it may not be exactly how I understand it, right? Because it's not my experience. And so thinking about how opportunities like this can work to prevent extremism, I mean, this is a great opportunity, and it doesn't have to just be with us. Like, it's great if we can get non-veteran communities, because I'll say I'm the perfect example of a veteran who, my last day of service, and I was leaving that behind. It was 20 years before I ever did anything as a veteran again, because I was a civilian now. This was my new identity, and I was moving on. And so even to get other community organizations, Habitat for Humanity, Red Cross, like any of those, to get veterans to realize what an asset they can be if you can speak to them, if you can bring them in. Corporations understanding the value of their veteran ERGs, employee resource groups, is not just being to get employees, but to really engage them in your community, because you don't want unhappy veterans in your ranks in your corporation either, right? It's so just how bringing veterans in these, again, having them engage in civic health, whether it's advocacy, whether it's volunteerism, whether it's working at the polls, but giving them these opportunities to be in community, to see and be a part of something different than they have been in before, but finding ways that what they've done before is really important to using and continue to using as they are as a civilian.
Yeah. No, I love that. And you sparked a thought while you were talking, and I was wondering, like, how realistic are veterans and their expectations of what they can find in the civilian world? Because, like, if I'm in Iraq or Afghanistan with a squad for 13 months, I mean, there are durable bonds that are going to be formed in extremis that are, you can't reproduce that anywhere in the world, right? Other than being with the squad in combat. And I'm wondering, like, sometimes a question like, do we have realistic expectations of what we can find out in the civilian space?
I think so. I know for me personally, and like I felt like I was very prepared for reintegrating into the civilian world because I had worked for 3 or 4 years after graduating college in the civilian world before I even joined the Navy.
Yeah.
So I'm like, all right, it's only been 6 years. I know how to write a resume. I know how to put on a suit, et cetera, et cetera. Like, so I'm comfortable with this, but was still very surprised that it wasn't the job that I had an issue with. It was really that sense of purpose. And so in some ways, I guess it was the job, but I was not expecting to have such a hole where it was just that. I did not have the camaraderie anywhere close to that I had with my shipmates when I was shipboard. Even on shore duty, there still is a bond that you get, I think, with other people in uniform that you're working with that you just don't get in the civilian world.
Sure.
And I was surprised at how quickly that happened. And it's what ultimately led me to coming back and joining IAVA and looking at veterans organizations.
Sure.
And again, going back to that 10 years, it took me about 8, 9 years before I was like, okay, this defense contractor stuff isn't working for me. It's a great job, but like, I'm just not having a sense of fulfillment at the end of the day. And how can I fix that?
Yeah, it's funny. You try to get out and then, right back in. What would, for both of you, how could DoD make your lives easier? We're out here in the civilian space. We've walked that path. Any veteran getting out kind of needs somebody to come up alongside and hold the lamp and say, hey, I know that road ahead's a little, it's a little shady. Mm-hmm. It's discovery learning's involved. You may be not feeling super confident. We've done it. You're not going to be living in a bridge, down by the river. Like, you can do this. Like, I promise you. But like, we're out here waiting to catch. But what's the disconnect between them leaving DoD, taking off the uniform the last time, and you getting in touch with them?
I'll say for our experience, it's being able to get in touch with them. Yeah. It's amazing how hard it is to connect with them, either as they're transitioning or anything else. There's a lot of bureaucracy out there, and even Jeremy referenced Transition Assistance Program, TAP, and what we find is it's different wherever you go. Mm-hmm. So it's really trying to figure it out. Like, can you get somebody at the local level who can go onto a base and actually make this happen? And you might get in there, and you might not, as opposed to being able to just start with the VA or whoever runs it and getting them to. And again, a veteran might not be ready for it right when they get out, but at least that planting of the seed of when you're ready. These organizations exist, and they might not remember who they are or anything else, but they'll hit that point potentially that they know there are places out there. There are organizations out there where I can go. But for us, it's absolutely, it's just even being able to get the message out. Mm-hmm. I mean, they have the audience that they really need to hear it, right? Yeah. If they want good things to be said about the military, you need good things to be said about veterans. Mm-hmm. And so recognizing that and helping veteran service organizations have access, and get that word out and get that exposure.
Yeah. No, I did say that's absolutely the key. And like, I think some of it is going back to my own experience. When I got out in 2006, I had a job. I was feeling good there. I didn't have any medical issues, so I wasn't. And at the time, as probably with many veterans or service members that are getting out, like, I thought the VA was only there for health care. Yeah. I kind of knew about the GI Bill, and I had that, but I got a master's through the Navy, so I'm not worried about that. Mm-hmm. I don't need health care, so I'm not even looking at the VA pamphlets. Right. But I think if I'd have learned about the Mission Continues, Team Rubicon, things like that, where it's like, oh, that is what interests me. Like, I'm not necessarily interested in getting help with the VA and stuff like that. But if there's opportunities for me to go out there, volunteer, do really cool things, be able to give back in a different way, like, I'm interested in that. And I would pick that up. And so I think that some of it is getting access to the service members, and then also making sure they're aware of the wide spectrum of VSOs that are out there. Yeah. There's probably a lot that only think about, the American Legion, VFW, and still have the thought that, it's just, guys sitting around smoking, swapping war stories.
Some dark old bar.
Exactly.
Yeah, but I think, because even my own, I got out in 2015, and nobody briefed me during TAP about VSOs, the opportunity to join. Thank God some colonel pulled me aside and said, hey, go to one of the VSOs and have them file your VA claim.
Yeah.
Sign a power of attorney, they'll take it. I mean, and it was like butter. The whole thing just, I mean, it was wired. And it was a big rock out of my pack doing that. But like, you're not getting lists from personnel over at DoD saying, here's all the veterans coming off of active duty and their email addresses. And I understand PII issues for personal information, but it's almost like organ donation. You go to get your driver's license renewed, and you have to opt out of organ donation to not be on that list, right? And that seems like it might be a reasonable solution for DoD, is to have an opt-out thing in TAP, where it's just like, we will give your information to the VSOs for them to contact and help you, unless you tell us not to.
Yeah.
Would that be helpful?
I certainly think so. I mean, it's one of those things where I feel like there's got to be a relatively simple solution. It doesn't cost a lot of money, and it would help DoD and VA. Like you said, it's, to have people talking well about the military, you need to have people that are happy as veterans so that they can recommend it and things like that. And so there should be a solution there that we can easily get at. It seems like that's it. I think most of us would agree. But, I think we're all familiar with DoD bureaucracy and things like that. And so yes, it's how do we get to the right people to make that happen? Definitely.
We're going to have to put that one on the task list.
Exactly.
That needs to get done. Because I'm told back in the day they would send lists out. But I want to shift to the Veteran Service Organization community at large. I noticed after J6, certain groups spoke out, and certain groups were conspicuously absent. And I'm not asking to name anyone or any organization. I want to embarrass anybody, but it was evident. It was evident, like, who kind of saw this as a watershed moment and took a stand, which planted the thought in my head, like, how aware are we as a community, like within the VSOs that you meet with and navigate with, on a fairly regular basis, of the threat that extremism poses, of what to do, if identified, of how to train their staffs, how to respond. Like, what's your thoughts on, student, could we start with that maybe? Or?
Yeah, I think, like we both said earlier, it was eye-opening for us. We just, again, our experience with veterans is very different. And I think there's, to be honest, I feel it's one of those, do we really want to tie ourselves to that organization, right? Do we want to be part of an extremism organization, given who we are and what we do? So I think it's about, how do we get involved in it the right way? What does that look like? I can speak from our organization. It hasn't been a way that we think about ourselves. It's one of those, like, as we think about ourselves in the mental health space, as we think about ourselves in suicide prevention, it's not what we do, but it's a benefit of what we do. Right. That we can improve. If you follow the lines out and you look at the research, volunteerism can reduce the risk of suicide, can improve your mental health benefits. And I think it holds the same here, that it's again, we won't become an anti-extremism organization, but we certainly have a place in this to be able to make sure, or to try to give up veterans the space where they don't head down that road.
Yeah, for sure. Jeremy?
Yeah, I think the short answer is yes, but. And the but is, how do you ask that question? If you ask the question before January 6th, or even after for that matter, are there a lot of veterans that are following down the path of extremism? You're going to get a lot of pushback from a lot of people. I think if you ask the question, hey, are there a lot of vets out there that are disaffected with how they've been treated? Are there a lot of veterans out there who feel disconnected from a community? Are there a lot of vets that are angry at the VA and feel that they've been cheated out of things that they were promised and that are not being delivered? You would get yes, absolutely, because we certainly see that all the time, and we know that that's the case. And I think those questions are very similar, because as we were sort of saying in the beginning, that's how I think in many ways you get veterans that are down that path, is by not taking care of them in the ways that they should be taken care of. And that is why I feel like much of the conversation needs to be not about extremism within the military and veteran community, but just how do we better serve our veteran community.
Sure, absolutely. Yeah, and I think for like the stakeholder groups, the memberships, it totally makes sense. I'm thinking for leadership though, like how aware is the leadership, tracking on this? Because either they saw things like this happening and didn't do anything, right? Or they were unaware of the extreme nature of the threat, or ill-prepared to figure out what to do in response to it, right? Like discovery learning is painful. When we don't know what to do, we look to other people for cues. If they're not doing anything, we're not as likely to take action, things like that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think it's not knowing what to do. Like,
Yeah.
I mean, we were the same way, when I testified in the panel, that was the struggle. It was like, our primary role was trying to convince members of Congress that there's an issue that needs to be handled. But if you had asked me at that time, like, what are the solutions? I was like, that's a good question.
Yeah.
Still, and we're getting there now. And like this week has been great because we've been brainstorming a lot of stuff, and I think we've gotten a lot further. And I don't say that as an excuse for the leaders back then, but I think that was a big challenge of sort of like, man, I don't know how we fix this.
Yeah, it's like uncharted territory in a way. Because I mean, I like to be an optimist and think, well, maybe they just didn't know caught everybody by surprise. They haven't been really tracking on this as much as other people have because they're executing their core missions. And but I would be curious, like if we were to hold an event in DC for the leadership, because most groups, have some representation there, to say, here's a threat brief from the FBI, here's a threat brief from Homeland Security. We think we should stand for these expectations for the veteran community and have a resolution. Get input from other communities on what to do, right? The see something, say something, do something kind of chain could be potentially very helpful for the VSO leadership, right? I mean, that's not that they would have to immediately turn to some like huge campaign within their organizations, but at least they could do training. They could, take steps in that direction. So.
And I would love to see that, frankly, happen behind the scenes so that I think you would get more VSO buy-in, because I think that's the problem is many of them are like, I will get flame sprayed by my community if I in any way put out a suggestion that, there's these issues out there.
Sure.
And I think that's why the response was muted in many cases.
Yeah,
So,
and then ones with membership-based models have there's a financial repercussion for them for taking different positions. Yeah. What are we doing that's not working?
I'm happy to jump in there.
Go ahead.
You want me to start? As we've talked about this, and I'll try and make it quick. I mean, I think and I alluded to this in the beginning, and this is what January 6th certainly got me thinking about, but to a big extent, thinking about it before, ties in with Vet the Vote and everything. I mean, I think we are failing our own country in how we approach our democracy. And by that, I mean, we need to get rid of gerrymandered election districts. We need to switch to open primaries. We need to implement things like ranked choice voting, which is, all of these are in place around the country, and I think what you see is a much better job of getting people to vote, feeling good about the results, and liking what they're hearing from those that are running for office. And if we could get that across this country, that's something that doesn't require constitutional changes, doesn't even require Congress. This is a local, state and county level endeavor that I think would reap huge rewards, because it would get the extremists, and I use that term to refer to both parties, farther away from Congress.
Right.
Because the current system rewards extremism. If you look at the way primaries work, we were just talking about this. It's what everyone talks about. You push to the left or the right in your primary, and then once you win the primary, you shift right back to the middle. So you're basically having a system where people running for office are lying to those that they want to vote for them by telling them what they want to hear and then shifting to a larger audience.
Yeah, I've helped several friends run for Congress on both sides of the aisle, and just watching that experience, that needs to change. Gerrymandering, I mean, the people need to pick their politicians, not the politicians picking their voters. I mean, 100%. And that's like changes at the level of civics, though, right? I mean, that's below politics. It's kind of like structural changes to the system. What do you see that is working right now?
I mean, you should talk about Vet the Vote.
I'll talk about Vet the Vote. Yeah, I'll jump on that. And so we realized last fall, part of our mandate is to promote positive civic engagement. And we started hunting around for like what to do, and had several examples of veterans who had served as poll workers and said, I got to tell you, I've deployed around the world, I've been to combat twice. This is the most significant thing I've done as a citizen, because I've voted absentee ballot my entire adult life till this. And we started Vet the Vote to recruit 100,000 election poll workers, to get veterans and their family members into the polls to help out and bridge a nationwide shortage in election poll workers. So we need about 1.3 million in the country to do it every year. For every election, they were short about 130,000 is the stat we got. We did some back of the cocktail napkin math and said 17 million vets, how many do we need to get to close this gap? And so we set an audacious goal of 100,000, and I'm proud to say this week we've got 55,000 recruited. But the experience that I had as a ballot judge in my county was, in today's hyper-partisan environment, this is one place where Republicans and Democrats and independents, volunteers got together to run a polling station, to help Republicans, Democrats, and independents vote. So that for me was a real eye-opening experience of like civics, not politics, and something that we can all come together to work on. So super powerful thing. I think, I'd be remiss not to point out Chris Goldsmith's work today. Launched a big effort, Task Force Butler, and there's other ways to help besides the VSO route. And what Task Force Butler is about is researching and looking at extremist groups in the country, specifically Patriot Front, and it's a public education campaign. So they're collecting all this information and putting it places where academia, law enforcement agencies, all these folks who are working on this problem can go to and see what these groups are up to. And really, I think the ultimate goal is that they incur economic and social costs for their anti-democratic behavior, right? So if you haven't seen his 268-page report, Chris, that y'all put out today, congratulations on that. Chris has been doing some incredible work over the years, researching and bringing the nation's attention to the fact that there's mis-, and malinformation groups, both domestic and foreign, that are targeting veterans. And so I just wanted to point you out and applaud you and thank you for that work, Chris. What questions do we have from the audience? I think we have had about 9 minutes left. I'll check the notepad. Yeah.
Isn't that your job?
Yeah. Nope. Okay, nothing there. Sir, please.
I'm a member of the Veterans of Foreign Wars organization. One of you from there?
No, neither of us are. We work with the VFW in Washington, D.C. quite a bit, but not members.
Get a copy of the new act that passed Congress. They told me to go take a look at it.
The Pact Act?
The Veterans of Foreign Wars told me to go take a look at it. The Pact law.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
yeah.
Yeah, great question. It was like you're a plant in the audience there. There's nothing I like talking about more. No, and so that was a big thing. The Pact Act is all about taking care of veterans that were exposed to toxins during their time in service. And the big focus on it was post 9/11 veterans that were exposed to burn pits in Iraq and Afghanistan, things like that. But it also adds more support for Vietnam-era veterans that were exposed to Agent Orange. It helps with Camp Lejeune veterans that were exposed to poisoned drinking water. And so that's one of the things that IVA is focused on is getting the word out about that. So I'm happy to get with you afterwards, and I can send you all the materials and information on that. But it kind of speaks to this issue of how veterans become angry, because poisoning our own service members is not something new. And I shouldn't be laughing as I say that, but it's kind of just absurd to say out loud. But
Yeah.
this is something that didn't start with Agent Orange in Vietnam, and it certainly didn't end with burn pits or the passage of this legislation, as big as this legislation is. We currently have issues right now of mold in barracks that are making service members sick, fuel tanks that are leaking into the drinking water in Hawaii. It is a nonstop fight to get the U.S. government to own up to the fact that we are poisoning our own service members, and we then turn around and deny it. Oh no, not our fault. Yeah, just because your hair's falling out, that's not our fault. It's a nonstop fight, and it makes veterans angry. And frankly, most of the country doesn't know about it, and often veterans don't even know about it. They're not aware until years later when you're like, oh yeah, were you stationed there? Yeah, did you know that, PFAS, go Google that. And there's a lot of stuff there. So
Definitely.
I could keep going, but I will stop.
Awesome. No, but thanks. And IVA was at the forefront of that effort to get that legislation passed. So, thanks to you. And I know it was a work of a lot of folks, but
A lot, yes.
we saw a lot of groups advocating for those changes. What other questions are out there? Please.
So are there any organizations that are, kind of look at the data of the folks in the military, either active or veterans, that have become radicalized, to try to determine whether they're getting radicalized either before, during their active service, or afterwards? Is there anyone studying that?
There is, and the number I've got, and Bill, correct me if you're here and I'm wrong, but 10 years is the average time post-service. I think that is that the number you're hearing?
Yeah, I think that's right.
Yeah, so I think there's that data out there. There are groups looking at it. I know the University of Maryland Start Center is one, who I think has probably the most comprehensive database, individual database of people convicted of terrorism-related crimes. But
Is that suggesting that, like, I mean, in other words, are there no active kind of duty members that are already radicalized? Do you think that
Oh no, there definitely are.
there are.
Yeah.
Yeah. But
Absolutely.
you're saying that people that actually commit crimes?
correct. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the average time span is 10 years after service for most. Yeah. What other? Does that answer your question?
Kind of. I was trying to get a sense of whether there's something that can be done before people get into the military to identify
Oh.
people that are susceptible to radicalism.
Yeah.
Already been radicalized.
Yeah, I mean, that's on the recruiting side.
Yeah,
There's
and I think it's
pretty-
one of those challenges where there's folks looking at it, and part of it is convincing leaders that that is worth doing. But then you also get into the pushback of like, okay, well, how do I do that? You know, if you come in to the recruiting station, is it okay for us to then start searching all your social media to find out what you've posted in the past? And, you know, if you're coming in as a 17-year-old that wants to join, how much can we hold against you, what you posted when you were 14 or things like that? And I'm not arguing that we shouldn't be doing this, but this is some of the conversations that are being had. And there's probably others that are smarter on this, but like as I kind of pick up on this, there's a lot of debate about, one, should we do it, how we do it, and can it legally be done? And that's why, and I think also are we getting at the root of the problem by doing that? And these are open discussions. You know, do we know how many extremists there are within the military? We don't even come close. But there are certainly, we're starting to learn more, and there's certainly anecdotal evidence of people that are like, oh yeah, you know, the guy that I served with and had to, you know, bunk with for 2 years had a swastika tattoo and things like that. I mean, it is definitely out there, but there's a lot still to be learned. And I think we're moving in that direction a little bit.
Does that answer your question? Awesome. Thanks. What other questions do you have?
I love the Q&A.
Okay. Yeah, because I mean, there's really. Sorry.
So today there was this news, right, that like a group of veterans who are, I don't even know if it's a group of veterans, a group of advocates who were very upset about the January 6th
Oh yeah.
prosecution, right, that they were jamming the Veterans Crisis
Yes.
protest.
Mhm.
Jam the Veterans Crisis line. Do you see the VA increasingly becoming a target?
This is a good question. I mean, I think so. I feel like the VA is always a target because there's always again, it's one of those things. I don't mean to laugh about it, but it doesn't matter what administration is in or what is going on. I feel like there's always the VA is failing the veterans, and that's sometimes the case. I feel like that's a bad narrative, and this is kind of getting slightly off topic, so I guess I'm going to try and swing it back. But I guess that's one of the things I always try and push back on is like oftentimes when we're talking about ways in which VA is doing things badly, one, we need to be very careful in not painting it with a broad brush that just says VA sucks and we need to just outsource care to the community and things like that. But then I think you do get that change from administration to administration in terms of what the VA is focusing on and what they're doing as to how they get attacks from the left or the right. And by attacks, I'm talking more political attacks, not something like that, which is horrible. And I only just saw a little bit of coverage of that. Obviously, not appropriate, helpful, and it's frankly downright criminal when you hear about things like that. So I'm not even sure if I answered your question. I kind of just went off on a bit of a tirade there.
Well, I think we're at 4:30, and I don't want to
Oh, yes.
abuse our host's time, but I just wanted to say thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you for your thoughts and comments. It's been a pleasure speaking with you last night over, talking about these issues, and it's always good to see you both. So thank you for making the trip, and I've thoroughly enjoyed your thoughts.
Thank you.
Joe. Appreciate it. Thank you.